Hey, and welcome. So, did Jesus declare all foods clean? Did Paul even talk about it? Does the New Testament teach against the kosher laws? Well, you better pour yourself a glass of whiskey and grab a Bible because we're going to talk about it tonight. This is Killing the Church. Bradley, my brother, how you doing?
I am doing spectacular. Really stoked about that intro.
What you got to drink tonight?
I'm still working through this Angel's Envy. Like I said, I only drink it when I'm up here. So, you know.
Man, you need to start switching stuff up. You've been drinking the same thing for episodes.
I know. I gotta get smaller bottles is what it is. Get smaller bottles and I'll have more occasion to try something new. But I think I know what I'm gonna try next. I'm not gonna reveal it just yet, but I know what I'm gonna try, and I think it'll be awesome.
So I'm actually I'm gonna go to the crowd for this one. So I have some gold label 18-year here. It's a Johnny Walker classic. Or I have this Drumshambo. You can't really see it. It's too bright. It's a single pot still Irish whiskey. And I'm torn between the two because I really, really like both. And it will be this will be the first whiskey I've had in this new house. Ooh. And I don't know which one I want. So I'm going to let the crowd decide. So let's hear what you pick between the two, the Irish or the Scotch. And then I'll pour myself one. We'll see how it goes.
Well, if I get a vote, I'm just going to say, like, it's the first one in your new home. I would go with the Irish, but.
Do you think so? The Drumshambo?
That's my vote, but, you know, we can wait and see what everybody else says.
Oh, yeah. We got, 3 for the Irish. Yeah. Yeah. Well, you have spoken. Well, while I'm pouring myself and everyone else should be pouring themselves one as well. If you are joining us in a drink, what are you drinking? Leave a comment. Man, it's straight up like everyone's in the Irish except Bobby K. Drink my blood. I'm down for that too, but that's not kosher.
Which is coincidentally, you know, what we'll be talking about tonight.
Yeah.
So, you know, there's that.
So let's do it. Let's get into it. So now we've already done an Acts chapter 10 video.
Right.
In the past.
Right. It's a pretty simple one. Acts 10 is not a good one to use against kosher law.
Honestly, it's one of the weakest of the common arguments that we hear a lot of. Because that one's explained twice, and both times it's explained.
Right.
You know, it's nowhere near anything about food. So the food is an object lesson, but we do go into great detail. We have a whole video on Acts chapter 10 dedicated to painstaking details so that everything is super, all bases are covered in that one. So if you haven't seen that yet, definitely go check that out after you watch this video because we're live right now. So don't stop watching right now. That'd be kind of, anyway. But we are going to talk a little bit about Acts chapter 15 briefly. And then hopefully hopefully I have enough time. I want to get to Mark chapter 7, specifically verse 19, Romans chapter 14, Colossians 2:16 and through 22, and 1 Timothy 4:4. Those are a lot of the common objections that we hear a lot of.
Yes.
So we hope that this episode will cover all of those bases so that next time you, fellow Torah observer, get into an argument with another somebody online, be it Christian or non-Christian, doesn't matter. and you're just like, you know what? These two people, they're super dope. They put together a whole video going over all these details. I'm just going to put that video in the chat. You can watch it and not waste your time. So that's kind of the goal. We're going to do all the time wasting for you. Anyway, so let's just jump into it. Let's go straight to Acts 15. What do we got?
Yeah, Acts 15, I think, is also one of my favorites because this is one where really the context couldn't be more clear, but it necessitates some historical context, right? It necessitates some historical understanding and then a little bit of logic.
Yeah, so I'm just setting my stuff up here so that my Bible remains open. So, in fact, you know what? Here's what we should do. And Austin, I have noted 1 Corinthians 10:27. We're going to hit that one up if we have time to. Hopefully we have time for all this. It should be fine. Acts 15. So, let's specifically... yeah, where do you want to begin with this one?
Honestly, my favorite place to begin is really with Peter's statement, or kind of the preface before. So this is one that you kind of have to take as a whole chapter. Not even just a whole chapter. Really, you can't read this without being influenced by the events of chapter 13, right? That this whole meeting is taking place because of what is occurring in chapter 15. So you can't read this chapter separate from chapter 13. So let's see. Probably the best verse. Tell you what, we'll start in verse 1. Now some men coming down from Judea were teaching the brothers, unless you are circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved. Paul and Barnabas had a big argument and debate with them. The brothers appointed Paul and Barnabas with some others from among them to go up to Jerusalem to the emissaries and elders about this issue, so this is funny. Got into a discussion recently about whether or not, James was such an elder naturally or if he just assumed the role. But James kind of stayed in Jerusalem because that was his place. So he was already this would imply that he was one of the elders in this scenario.
Right.
Okay. Let's see. When they arrived in Jerusalem, starting in verse 4, they were welcomed by the community and the emissaries and the elders. They reported all that God had done in helping them. But some belonging to the party of the Pharisees who had believed stood up, saying, "It is necessary to circumcise them and command them to keep the Torah of Moses." Okay, so
there's two questions actually.
Right, there's two, because this is where really there has to be an understanding of an appreciation for the fact that religiously, Jewish literature is not really that redundant, right? Particularly when it comes to matters of theology and spirituality. Being redundant is actually one of the things that is against certain precepts that are outlined in Pirkei Avot, right? Is not wasting words, and redundancy is wasting words, right?
That and it's a waste of ink. Ink and parchment is expensive back then.
Right. Exactly. So we already know that circumcision is implicit, right, in the law of Moses. It's already part of the Torah. So you don't need to mention physical circumcision, right? The circumcision of the flesh. That if you're already going to mention the Torah, then you didn't need to mention it prior to, right? Because that's a redundancy. But Peter's answer actually gives us a little more insight into what's being referenced here. So in verse 7, it says, "After much debate, Peter stood up and said to them, 'Brothers, you know that in the early days God chose from among you by my mouth the Gentiles should hear the message of the good news and believe. And God who knows the heart, testified to them by giving them the Ruach HaKodesh, just as he also did for us. He made no distinction between us and them, purifying their hearts through faith.'" Why then do you put God to the test by putting a yoke on the neck of the disciples, which neither we nor our fathers have been able to bear? This is where a little bit of historical context and logic comes in. The common understanding of this is that, well, he's referring to the law, right? Because nobody could do the law. It's impossible. Couldn't be done. Well, that's just not true. The law in and of itself says that it can be done. And not only that, you're not going to find that in Jewish theology anywhere. You can search through the depths of even the Qumran texts, right? You can search through Talmud, Mishnah. You can dive deep into Sepharia. You're never going to find an idea that Torah is impossible to keep.
The Torah says the opposite, in fact.
Right. And well, not only that, John, right? 1 John 5:3 says the opposite. So we already have confirmation in the New Testament that this isn't even a thought that the apostles had, right? We know that they didn't think this way. So we have to set that idea aside, right? Understand that they were Jews. They had already grown up doing the Torah. This was part of the lifestyle that they lived in. So there's a burden they had already borne. Also, remember, they were Jews. They had all been circumcised on the 8th day, right? So that is also a burden they had already borne. So what are they talking about? What is a burden that none of them, being Jewish men, had ever borne at this point? That coincidentally is also called circumcision back in this day.
Yeah, that's another. So for those not tracking quite yet, the conversion process is a lot of the times shorthanded into the phrase circumcision. But it's a whole process. It's a process that can take anywhere between a year to 3 years. In most cases, 3 years, especially back then. And these days, maybe a little bit different depending on your level of knowledge, but a lot's expected of you for a conversion process. And it's shorthanded into this phrase circumcision. And if we go all the way back to the first verse of the chapter, that really sets the precedent, right? Because there's a second question is introduced at verse 5, I believe. Yeah, at verse 5. But the primary question, verse 1, unless you are circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved. So the question is, do you have to be converted into Judaism to be saved? That's the question of Acts 15.
It's also noteworthy that it's referred to as the custom of Moses. So we're not talking about something in the written Torah here. This is actually a direct reference to what would be the oral tradition, right? Mm-hmm. You don't refer to Torah law as custom. It's never referred to as custom. Custom would be something other than the written Torah.
That would be custom is a tradition. It's a minhag. It's a tradition. Yeah. And they're admitting that this is a tradition. And then, so verse 5, we have the addition, right, from those of the parties of the Pharisees who had believed. It is necessary to circumcise them and command them to keep the Torah of Moses, or the law of Moses, whatever translation you happen to be using. So that's a small addition to the whole thing. And it would make sense that Pharisees would make that small addition. It was like, well, not only do they need to be converted, but once they convert, now you have to be observant, right? Because you've converted. So that's a small addition, but the main focus here is still the idea of conversion. Does one have to convert? This sets the precedent for the letter that gets written as a result of this debate. So, and you said it, what's the burden that neither he nor his forefathers could bear? It's a conversion process. It's incredibly difficult. And if you were a born Jew, you've never had to go through it. You have no idea what that's like. And in many cases, it's much easier, right, for you to just kind of go back into an observant lifestyle, because you don't have, it's not the same thing. You don't have to go through a conversion process. You're already there. And I've said this in the past. It's kind of a controversial statement, but I'll say it and pass it off to you. But the conversion process is so difficult that there are some natural born Jews who wouldn't make the cut. I mean,
yeah. Even in this day,
Yeah. that's the burden. That's the yoke. It's not the yoke of Torah, which is rarely ever used that way, by the way.
Right. Sparingly. And even then, when it's referred to as a yoke, it's usually being juxtaposed to a different kind of yoke, the same way that Yeshua uses the phrase, right? He says that his yoke is easy and his burden is light. It's being juxtaposed to an alternative kind of yoke, and we do read this in Pirkei Avot, it's contrasting the yoke of government versus the yoke of Torah. Essentially, what it's saying is that if you accept upon yourself the yoke of Torah, then the yoke of government is absolutely unnecessary, and this is more or less true. Right? If you live according to the Torah, then pretty much in any society you live in, be it capitalist, communist, what have you, you're probably going to do all right in that society by the governmental law.
Yeah, but for sure, back to like sort of its context here, the yoke that neither he nor his forefathers had to bear is, and so that's what I wanted to say. Excuse me. Most of the time when you see yoke, it's in relation to who's teaching you follow specifically, right? So you have the two famous, right? Shammai and Hillel. You have the strict letter versus the spirit of the law. Generally speaking, you would accept upon yourself a yoke of one or the other's type of observance, right? If you were to convert today, this is just an example, you could convert and be converted to Ashkenazi or to Sephardi traditions. And each of those would be described in this context as like a sort of yoke. You can convert into Sephardic tradition and accept the yoke of Sephardim traditions, which would be like waiting 6 hours between meat and dairy. Or you could be under the yoke of an Ashkenazi tradition, which is 3 hours between meat and dairy. You know, the Sephardic yoke would be no meat and no dairy and fish, whereas the Ashkenazi, they don't really make that distinction. They don't care. Fish is considered a vegetable to the Ashkenazi. So Ron Swanson is an Ashkenazi.
Oh, man. I don't know if I've heard that one.
Yeah, I made that connection a while ago. I was discussing the meat and dairy thing with some Ashkenazi, and I was like, oh, so it's practically a vegetable. So Ron Swanson was right. So anyway.
That's spectacular.
Yeah. So, but anyway, not only is this not... Right. So then we have our 4 prohibitions, right? And verse 21 is the key verse, right? We'll knock that out right away. They write this letter. The intention behind this whole letter is because verse 21. Do you want to go ahead and read that?
Right.
That verse?
So yeah, it's because it's so obvious that this is the main point of the entire of everything that James says, right? It's literally in the statement itself. So you get the 4 prohibitions, right, James? He gives the 4 prohibitions. We'll go over those in a little bit. And he says, for, or because, right? Because Moses from ancient generations has had in every city those who proclaim him, since he is read in all synagogues every Shabbat. Remember, we're talking about a response to what happened in chapter 13. What happens in chapter 13? We have Jews in the synagogue. You also have Gentiles in the synagogue. And then some animosity gets built up between Jews and Gentiles, and whether or not the Gentiles belong in the synagogue, whether or not they can be or are allowed to be in the synagogue, right? And so the whole discussion is, well, they have to convert and learn the law of Moses, right? In order to be allowed into the synagogue. James essentially says, no. These 4 things, right, which is interesting. I think we should probably pull out Tractate Gerim also in reference to this. But yeah, James says, no. These 4 things, why? Why only these 4 things? Well, because Moses is already taught in the synagogue every Sabbath, right? This whole point is so that they can be allowed in the synagogue. Do these 4 things, they can be allowed in the synagogue. They'll learn Torah as they go.
The point is to get them into the synagogue. That's the whole point. James says it right there, plain as day. Now, and we're actually, when we get to the Romans 14 verse, we're going to go into why it's a problem that Gentiles are intermingling in the synagogue with fellow Jews. that is an issue. It's an issue of purity, actually, and we're going to talk about that. But before we move on from Acts 15, because that's the hammer right there on the table, you know, that
Yep.
the whole point is to get them in the synagogue. I can guarantee you that I've put it this way before. Acts chapter 15. There is not a new religion yet. There's still only Judaism, and that's it. And then there's a bunch of Gentiles who also think that they figured out who the Messiah is, or that they've been revealed who the Messiah is, which is a Jewish concept, is a Jewish Messiah. So they're going to a Jewish synagogue to learn about the Jewish Messiah, because it's the only religion that they have to choose from if they believe in a Messiah. There's no Christianity yet. So there's not this. This is not a church versus the synagogue thing. There is only the synagogue here.
Well, it's noteworthy, right? Again, the evidence is just clearly in the passage. That's why the convening happened in Jerusalem. That's why it happened among Pharisees, and that's why James, who was a Pharisee, was the one who presided over the meeting as the final judge, right? Because this wasn't something other than Pharisaic Judaism. This was still Pharisaic Judaism.
Mm-hmm. Whether you like that or not, that was the only option. And that's what was going on at the time. And that was becoming kind of an issue. It was starting to raise some concerns. And we'll talk about that in Romans 14. But specifically, if anything, and this is why I love going to Acts 15 when people bring it up, this letter enforces the kosher laws, if nothing else. It strengthens them. And so I have here in front of me a resource from First Fruits of Zion. I got to credit them because I'm basically going to read it. It's very, very good, but we are going to talk about the actual resource material as well. So verse 19, therefore I judge not to trouble those from among the Gentiles who are turning to God, but verse 20, but to write to them to abstain from the contamination of idols. That one's pretty self-explanatory. From sexual immorality, okay, fair enough. From what is strangled, and from blood. So that's the part I want to focus on.
Tell you what, before we get to that, I love that sexual immorality follows, right? Because so many in modern Christianity treat that like that's a real hard, fast blanket statement that is thoroughly clear in its definition. And they'll even go into the Greek definition of that and everything. But at the end of the day, it's not specific. It is a generality. It's a vague generality at that. What is sexual immorality, right? Is it just the three big ones that most Christians have a problem with, right? Homosexuality, premarital sex, and pedophilia. You know, like
incest can be thrown in there.
How? Right. Well, so that's actually one of my favorite questions that our boy Yochanan he loves to ask. Right? If Torah is done away with, can I marry my sister?
No.
But why? Why? Justify and rationalize from the New Testament alone, without referencing the Torah, why I can't marry my sister.
And that's a slippery slope, right? It's one of those things where if it's not repeated in the New Testament, then it doesn't transfer over. A lot of theologians no longer hold that position. That's not something that a lot of people will say anymore, because there's a lot of fallaciousness in that. Like bestiality alone is already back on the table suddenly, right? Because it's not mentioned in the New Testament. So, but yeah, I did something because you bring up an interesting point, because they're going to write them a letter with those 4 prohibitions. We have no idea the contents of this letter. Now, I know everyone's like, well, if you keep reading the contents of the letters, okay. We have a summary of the letter later on. We do not know the exact contents of the letter. Luke does not claim to write a letter word for word copy. They probably already had a copy and it was not necessary, so this is a summary. He's acting as a historian here. He's just making sort of a summary reference. It could possibly be word for word, or it could have been much more lengthy and with more explanation. We actually don't know. So there could be more to this. So we actually have to extrapolate historically, and that's what we're about to do here. So this is a big important bit. So if you get nothing else out of the rest of this episode, this is something that you should definitely get out of this episode. And you've got the track tape pulled up from the Mishnah. Ready?
Yes.
Dope. All right. So I'm going to read. The related prohibition on things strangled forbids disciples of Yeshua from eating the meat of animals that has not been ritually slaughtered according to the traditional Jewish method. The prohibition on strangled meat is just the negative collateral to the positive commandment in Leviticus 17:13 to pour out the blood. The Mishnah, which you have ready, uses the term strangled to refer to animals that are improperly slaughtered. So if you want to go ahead and you got that pulled up, go ahead and read that.
Right. Yeah. Mishnah Cholin 1:2. In the case of one who slaughters an animal with the smooth side of a hand sickle, which has both a smooth and a serrated side, or with a sharp flint, or with a reed that was cut lengthwise and sharpened, his slaughter is valid. All slaughter, and one may always slaughter, and one may slaughter with any item that cuts, except for the serrated side of a harvest sickle, a saw, the teeth of an animal when attached to its jawbone, and a fingernail, because they are serrated and they consequently strangle the animal and do not cut its windpipe and gullet as required.
So what we're trying to argue here is that the term strangled meat is idiomatic of an improper kosher slaughter.
Yes.
And we'll go on. Strangled meat refers to animals that have been slaughtered in a manner that left the blood in it. The blood was considered sacred to Jews. It's considered sacred by the Torah. You're not allowed to drink blood. That's a kosher law, which again is actually reiterated here in the letter to abstain from blood, because that's a kosher law. The prohibition of blood came under the same requirement, referring to the consumption of blood of animals in any form. These three requirements, abstain from food offered to idols and strangled in blood, thus were all dealing with matters of clean and unclean food. So in the footnote, strangled meat, i.e. meat from animals not slaughtered by pouring out the blood in conformity with biblical and Jewish practice. So if anything, in its context, this is like, you got to get kosher slaughtered meat, my guy. It's in the letter.
Yep. And to drive the point home, matter of fact, play me on, Seamus.
Oh.
We're doing it.
Oh, hold on.
All right, so there are a number of problems with trying to argue that this is simply a general mandate against strangulation. One of them is strangulation is scant in pagan culture at this time, or really any time in history. Strangulation was never a commonplace method of sacrifice or slaughter among pagans, especially for ritual reasons. But when we tie this directly into the very next part, which is to abstain from blood, right? Because that is a kosher law. What Seamus said is absolutely true. It's a kosher law, but it's not, right? The reason that you are to abstain from eating blood is because of really blood itself is its own topic, right? That spreads into numerous areas. So we're not supposed to eat blood, because that's where the life resides. That's why blood is so important in religious practice. That's why it's so important in temple practice. So really, you could say that the part of not eating blood actually directly pertains to the ceremonial law, that part that people say is done away with. And this is, again, further evidence that these distinctions, the moral, civil, and ceremonial, those distinctions, they're not biblical. They were invented by the modern church, and there's just no basis for them in scripture. And this particular kosher law regarding blood is evidence of that, because it's not just about what you're eating at this point. It directly ties in its reasoning to temple practice, which is ceremonial.
Oh, nope. There we go.
Yep, nope, don't like that.
Nope, don't like that at all. All right, so yeah, so Acts 15, not a good place to start if you want to talk kosher, because if anything, we've added a stringency that's technically a tradition, if anything. But again, we put everything back in its context. We're talking about Pharisees debating this whole thing, and Chulin 1 Sephim 2, it's chapter 1 Sephim 2. That's a Pharisee wrote that. So, and of course, we here on this channel, we also argue that Yeshua was a Pharisee. If he wasn't an ordained Pharisee, which he likely was, he was considered a peer by the other Pharisees at the very least. But we hold to that he was one of the Pharisees, a sage.
Currently working on a pretty big project on that front, actually.
Yeah, actually. So now we've hit 30 minutes on just Acts 15 alone. I knew that one was going to take forever.
Yep.
So these other ones, though, we should be able to knock out fairly quickly. At least Romans 14, I think, is going to be the one that takes the most time. Or do you want to hit Mark 7 first?
Oh, yeah. Mark 7 is actually a super simple one. Let's go there.
Let's do Mark 7. If everyone will sip your whiskey and turn in your Bibles to Mark chapter 7, verse 19.
Yeah, Mark 7 is way more simple than anybody gives it credit for. And again, it's another one of those really cut and dry ones. It's not a good one to use. There's really not a lot of oomph or strength behind it. When you get into a dispute with somebody about it, essentially what you end up arguing with is, well, it says purged foods, right? and then that's just what the discussion becomes, is you can throw any number of facts at them and they're just going to like lean on the generality of the statement they're reading in English. So yeah, what is it? Mark 7.
Mark 7:19. So actually, we can't read from the TLV because that's not gonna accomplish what we want to do. So let me grab a heresy real quick. Not a heresy. That's just a joke. I'm actually gonna try an ESV. These are one of the Bible translations that we often recommend because we think that it's a decent translation. Really, any standard translation is fine. In all reality, you just have to know what to look for. So Mark 7, verse 19, according to the ESV. Oh, it has the parentheses. Let's go. All right. Since it enters not his heart, but his stomach, and is expelled. Parentheses. Thus he declared all foods clean. Closed parentheses.
Right.
Oh,
so it is so important to understand the parenthetical note that is there. Because that's not what it says in the Greek text.
It's not even there.
Right? And anybody who will argue otherwise is being blatantly intellectually dishonest. If they want to say that it says that for it does not enter into his heart, but into his stomach, and then goes out into the sewer, purging all meats or cleansing all foods, right? And say that as an entire statement, that's accurate. But if they want to say that the Greek text says, in saying this, he cleansed all foods, that's a lie. It does not say that.
Yeah, not there in the Greek at all.
So let's backtrack here a little bit, though, because there are a few areas where this just goes way off the rails. To try and use this to justify the eating of unkosher food is already off base, because they're not talking about unkosher food here, right? They're talking about wheat, right? Eating
with unwashed hands.
With unwashed hands, right? So it's not an argument of whether or not eating bread or eating grain with unwashed hands renders it unclean. You could maybe make an argument that there is a dispute over whether or not it makes it unholy. That could be an argument that's to be made. I understand that Christianity struggles to distinguish unholy from unclean, which is a whole other discussion
right here. Yep.
But they're already talking about food that is already kosher, right? Food that is kosher, at least as far as biblically kosher, right? There are a bunch of other standards that go along with kosher that would fall into that whole it's unholy thing, right? But the idea of biblically kosher food, it cannot be made unkosher, right? A cow is a cow is a cow is a cow. It's a clean animal. It will never be an unclean animal unless you do something absolutely horrific with it.
Yeah, and then you have to kill it, actually.
Yep.
So
right.
Or
yeah.
if it does something to you, you might.
Right. So they're not talking about unclean meat at this point. It's not even the subject of discussion. So for us to inject that as the motive into the discussion is a misnomer. It's almost like making an argument, right? Like it's almost like there's a dispute between tobacco purists and people who work for big tobacco, right? Over which tobacco is better for you, right? Are you going to buy your cigarettes from the store, or are you going to roll your own, right? And then what Christians do with this are like, see, store-bought tobacco, fresh-grown tobacco, same. So crack is okay to smoke. It's like, they're not even talking about that.
Yeah, that was not what?
It's what we call a non sequitur. It's what we call a reach. It's what we call a stretch.
Yeah. So for this is the issue of eating with unwashed hands. Now, why is that important? And why is that distinction something that we need to make when it comes to the whole, even if thus he declared all foods clean, even if that were there, which it's not, that thing in the parentheses, not in the text at all. It's not there at all.
Right.
The Greek reads as follows. It does not enter into the heart, but into the stomach, and then goes out into the sewer, purging all meat. So that's a very friendly way of putting it.
Yeah,
it should read something more like, it doesn't enter into the heart, but instead it goes into the stomach and then out into the sewer when you poop.
Right. Or right. You could say it goes into the body and then it's purged from the body and goes into the sewer.
Yeah. And that's a little bit more friendly. I still like the word poop, so I'm going to go with poop.
Right.
Don't roll your eyes at me, Mrs.
Right. She's here to make sure we behave.
That's what I need. Another woman in my life telling me what to do. I'm kidding. That's why my Siri is a man's voice.
Terrible. But yeah, this is one of those that, like, look, okay, even if we grant, right, even if we grant that it does say that he cleansed all foods, that's still a non-starter argument, because he was an observant Jew. We here at Alternate Media would affirm he was a Pharisee. So unclean meat doesn't qualify as food to a Pharisee, right? That's very specifically why it's called unclean meat, not unclean food.
So, yeah. And so, in fact, he never uses the word unclean. So now here's the part where we're going to need you guys to kind of bear with us. We go over this in our Acts chapter 10 video, but for those of you who have not seen that yet or need a refresher, here you go. This word, it's the Strong's word G2839, Koinos, common or not holy or unholy. Yep. Sometimes it's rendered as unclean. That's not a good translation for it. The word koinos is common. That's why we say koine Greek, because that was the common Greek of the day. It's literally koine Greek is just common Greek or whatever the common Greek is. So that's sort of the root for that. This never means unkosher. This word is never, you look in the Septuagint, you look in the New Testament, it never, ever means unkosher. There's a different word for unkosher in Greek, and it's this one here, G169, nice, akathartos. unkosher, or Levitically unclean. It's the Greek equivalent to the word tameh. So if you have a Septuagint, an LXX, every time you see the word tameh in the Hebrew, which is the Hebrew word for unclean, right? Ritual impurity, it's the Greek word akathartos. Not the same thing as koino or koinos, depending on how you conjugate it. So
better make sure you're pronouncing that correctly. Otherwise, everything you just said is obviously wrong.
Yeah, we'll talk about that later. Obviously, my Hebrew is way better than my Greek. Fine, but I've been practicing. No, no. But so what so like if we go all the way back to Mark 7:14, rather verse 15, there's nothing outside of the man that can make him koinos, or not holy or common or unclean, by going into him. Rather, it is what comes out of the man that makes him koinos, common or not holy. This distinction is so important. You would use this word strictly for the kind of ritual purity that has to do with the temple, not this impurity here, tameh. You would not use koinos for akathartos. You wouldn't use these interchangeably. Someone who is actually unpure, right? Like if you eat unclean food, you become akathartos, you become tameh, you are unclean. Koinos is something that you would usually use for like bread, for this example. The question is, your disciples are eating with unwashed hands. Okay. The bread is considered holy and pure and fit for temple consumption as long as you wash your hands before you touch it and eat it. If you touch the bread and eat it with unwashed hands, it is no longer holy bread. It is now koinos bread. It's regular, unholy, totally common bread. And in this day and age, in this particular time frame, this is the historian in me. I should have had the Seamus Does a Rant pulled up, but whatever. This is the historian talking now. In this day and age, ritual purity was an obsession for some reason. We think that reason is because they were expecting the Messiah to come. But there's all sorts of archaeological evidence that in this time period, they are obsessed with ritual purity right now. So this means taking stuff that would normally only apply to the priesthood and putting it on the common person, or taking it upon themselves to do it. However it was looked at, koinos is what we're talking about. So a meat that is clean, otherwise kosher, can either be koinos or holy, like fit for temple consumption, like such as cow. Cow is kosher. Now, if it's slaughtered properly, but you eat it with unwashed hands, or there is something else is wrong with it, a Gentile touched it or whatever, it's not fit for temple consumption. It becomes koinos. The Jews at this time would abstain from eating even that, even though it's not a prohibition in the Torah. They would still do it because it was a purity issue. Unkosher meat is never not anything other than akatharton.
Right.
It can't be just common or unholy. It's akathartos. It's not kosher at all. This is not the same thing.
Right. Whether or not you slaughter it properly doesn't make a difference. It's still unclean.
Yeah, the akathartos, there's no getting around akathartos. So when Yeshua says here in verse 15, that word for unholy or unclean, depending on what your translation says, sometimes it says defiled. That's actually probably a better word, is defiled. It's koinos right here. So we're not talking about meat at all. Even if we're talking about meat, which we're not, we're actually talking about bread. But even if we were talking about meat, we're not talking about meat that's akathartos. He doesn't say here that there's nothing outside a man that can make him akathartos. He's not saying that. If he did say that, that would be a lie, because God said in Leviticus 11:44 that if you eat this, you will be akathartos. So part of this is, if Jesus says, oh yeah, nothing that goes into a man will make him unholy, that's a lie. You can't get away with saying that.
Right.
But he didn't say that.
This is one of those, to hold this position with respect to this passage presents a blatant and unescapable contradiction of the scriptures. And there's just no work around it.
Unless you read it in Greek, and then we're not talking about unkosher meat at all. It's koinos. It's things like bread and unwashed hands and meat that's, touched by a Gentile or whatever. It's different. It's not, has nothing to do with, Jesus didn't say, oh yeah, bacon's cool, dude. That's not here. That's not here. And that was my rant. I'm sorry. I definitely even got heated. I got my voice all raised up and everything. You did a rant. I get a rant. Now we're good. Now we're even.
Next one. We hit that. That was 15 minutes we hit on that one.
Okay. So I'm actually glad that we spent a little bit of time going over the difference between Koinos and akatharton, because the next one is Romans 14. Right here. I got and this is just a little bit. So we're still dealing with the same word. One thing that I need to I guess clarify here. Again, anywhere you see the word unholy or defiled or unclean, nowhere is the word akathartos being used in this passage, in this whole chapter. It is the word koinos. So, verse 1 and 2, I'll read it. Excuse me. Now, accept the one who is weak in faith, but not for the purpose of disputes about opinions. One person has faith to eat anything, but the weak eats only vegetables. Do not let the one who eats disparage the one who does not eat. Do not let the one who does not eat judge the one who eats, for God has accepted him. Okay, so that's actually the context of verse 14. So have you got verse 14 pulled up? Do you want to read that?
Verse 14 of Romans 14?
Yes, 14.
I know and am persuaded in the Lord Yeshua that nothing is unholy in itself, but it is unholy for the one who considers it unholy.
So, I've heard this one come up a lot, where it's like, well, if you consider that kosher or not kosher, that's up to you. That's sort of like an individual liberty thing. And I've actually used this verse in the past where people, if they want to argue with me, whether or not, like I should be keeping kosher, I'm like, well, if you take the wrong interpretation of Romans 14, at the very least, you should say it's up to me. Right. But as we've already discussed, this is not the word akathartos. If Paul said akathartos, that would be a lie because nothing trumps the Torah. The Torah says this is akathartos. This is tameh in Hebrew. This is unclean. So the reason the vegetable thing is important, this is another historian thing, and actually you're familiar with this too. I'm fairly certain. Yes. Yeah. If a Jew is to eat in the presence of a non-Jew, and let's say the non-Jew prepared his food, what can the Jew eat?
Vegetables.
Only vegetables. In fact, if a non-Jew prepares food for a Jew, so much as touches what would otherwise be a kosher meat, it becomes koinos. It becomes common. It becomes unclean. It doesn't become unkosher, but it becomes unclean, and so many Orthodox Jews wouldn't eat it because it was made impure.
Right.
So that's why he says eats only vegetables, because vegetables are not subject to this law, to this particular ruling. And so he's not saying, well, one person's a vegetarian and he's weak, although I love that argument because it's funny, but that's not what he's saying. But instead, remember when we talked about Acts chapter 15, now we've gone full circle here. Why is it a problem that Gentiles are hanging out in the synagogue? What do you do in a synagogue Friday night?
Well, you gather together and you fellowship, you potluck.
You potluck. You say your mincha mariv. Actually, you say your mincha first, and then you have what's called a meal between. It's your third meal. And yeah, you have a potluck, and you eat, and then sun finally goes down at some point, and then you have your final prayers, and you say goodbye to the Sabbath with Havdalah. But you're gathered together, and you're eating together. So, as I just said, if a Gentile so much as touches the meat, now it's koinos. Everybody at this time is obsessed with ritual purity. We know this from archaeology. That's why there are baptismals everywhere for some reason in this time period specifically.
Yep.
That's why it's a problem in Acts chapter 15. So if the Gentiles want to hang out, Well, that's a problem because now I can't have my steak dinner like I normally have because, well, he's eating from the same plate and that's a problem. He touched the plate. That's an issue. I can't because he's a Gentile. That's a problem. You see why this is an issue now. And why is it that Gentiles, when they touch meat, it becomes impure? Because all Gentiles in this time period are considered idolaters. And there's no getting around that. There's only one monotheistic religion at the time, and it's Judaism. So a big part of this is because, and if you read Mishnah and a lot of ancient texts, they don't even call Gentiles anymore. They stop with that word. They almost always exclusively use idolater. Because they just assume if you're not Jewish, you're an idolater. That's the assumption at the time.
Right.
We've got a Legend of Zelda reference in the comments.
Do we?
Yes. I think. I'm not sure.
So, verses 1 and 2 of chapter 14 set up for us that now we know that this is about ritual purity meat. And again, it's Koinos. It's not akathartos. So what is he saying? The ruling is, and many Jews probably still believe this, that if a Gentile which is an idolater, right? Because Roman Gentiles, even if they practiced Judaism, they were required by Roman law to sometimes go to the temple and offer sacrifices to an idol or something. So they're tainted with idolatry. It's in their hands. So you can see why he's saying the one who's weaker in faith still believes that Gentiles are unclean by virtue of the fact that they're Gentiles. Peter already had gone through this issue where he said the same thing, and then he was shown a vision where it's like, no, actually not. But not everyone's there yet. That's what Paul is saying. He's actually insinuating that Jew and Gentile are hanging out together, and this is a problem that's becoming a thing because they're hanging out together. This is not a separate religion. This is the same one religion. We just got Gentiles in it now.
Yep.
I don't know why I hit that. That was my bad. I didn't mean to click that comment. But you know what? It's up there, you know.
Here we go.
Yeah, whatever. Bobby K, yep. the meme lord. The meme Koinos. Anyway, do you have anything to add for verse 14?
No, not really. You kind of touched on everything that I would have touched on, and better than I would have. So,
yeah, I was just trying to build off of what I've already established for the Koinos, akathartos stuff.
Right.
And so I want to put this banner up. Koinos is a term used for kosher food that is not fit for temple service. It is never, ever, ever used, ever, in the context of non-kosher food. It's never, ever. You'll never see it. You'll find, you do a Old Testament, New Testament, Tanakh, lexicon of the Septuagint. Doesn't matter. No matter where you look in the biblical scriptures, you're not going to find it anywhere this being used in the case of an unkosher food. It strictly means ritual purity.
Yep.
So, do you want to help? Actually, you should hit this one. Colossians 2:16. Let's go. I know this one was in the comments, so we're going to hit it.
Yeah, let's go there. Hang on. Let me find Philippians, Colossians. Peanut butter cookies, right?
God eats peanut butter cookies, yeah.
Okay. Therefore, do not let anyone pass judgment on you in matters of food or drink, or in respect to a festival or new moon or Shabbat. These are a foreshadowing of things to come, but the reality is Messiah. So there's a few angles that you'll find argued here, actually. And you'll almost never get all of them from one person, at least not when they're in this verse, right? They may end up circling back to all of them, but you get the whole, well, those are a shadow of the things, and it's this building of the argumentation of the shadow, as though shadows are somehow inherently disconnected from the whole of what they are foreshadowing, when that's not true, right? The shadow exists because something is casting it, When you have that thing in sight, the shadow doesn't go away. It's still there, right? The difference is that you can see them and the shadow now, rather than just the shadow.
Yeah, the shadow is supposed to point to you where the substance is.
Right.
Real quick, I forgot to say this, but this comment reminded me that is exactly why they were pushing conversions on the Gentiles. Because if they convert, then it's not an issue. And Paul is very much against conversions. We've actually got a whole episode planned to do that in the future about Paul and conversions and whether one should or should not. We're not going to go into that tonight. But yes, that's exactly why in Acts chapter 15, they're pushing the conversion, because then it's not a problem. If they're Jewish, then they're not Gentiles, and they're not idolaters, and they can't make meat unclean. It's not an issue at all. But of course, the conversion thing is in and of itself an issue. But yes, that's exactly why they were pushing conversions. Okay. Now, first.
Back to, and this actually from my favorite lo-fi music channel.
Let's go.
Yes. Shadows follow the object casting it. This is absolutely true. A shadow doesn't do anything other than what the caster does, right? It's incapable of doing so, which means that when that which casts the shadow now is in full vision, if it looks different, if it looks like it is opposite, if it looks like it's in contradiction to what the shadow looks like, we have a problem. It's not just a problem of continuity. It is like literally a paradox.
In fact, in Hebrews, the book of Hebrews uses this analogy quite a bit. And people always take this out of context. The whole purpose of recognizing that these things are a shadow and the reality is the Messiah is because the idea is that you look to the shadow to get a general idea of what you're looking for in the substance. And that's why it's important that it does exactly what the substance do. As you said, it follows them everywhere, and it is exactly carbon copy, essentially.
This is where you get into the seedy area of, it seems, two opposing views on who the Antichrist is. Because there's this movement within Christianity, it seems to think that the Jews are going to be the ones who actually get fooled by the Antichrist, because he's going to come back to the stage and reinstate the Torah, and that's going to be the work of the Antichrist. It's like, well, then Torah is not a foreshadow of Messiah. It's actually a foreshadowing of Antichrist at that point, right? That becomes a problem. If your criteria for what makes him Messiah is that he gets rid of the Torah, you've got a problem. Because then Torah still is not being a shadow of the Messiah, right? The idea of Torah being a shadow of Messiah is that we should be able to look in the Torah and see what Messiah is going to do, see what he's going to be like, see how he's going to conduct himself, how he's going to rule. So when he's doing the opposite of that, well, that's actually the Antichrist.
Yeah. So this particular portion, and I've touched on this once before, and then I'll say this and we'll move on to the next one. Therefore, don't let anyone pass judgment on you in matters of food or drink or respect to a festival, new moon, or Shabbat. In the Christian mindset, what this means is, don't let anyone judge you for not doing these things. Well, it doesn't say that. And in fact, if you just change the context a little bit, and everyone in Colossae is actually they're a bunch of Gentiles, and they are keeping the kosher laws, and they are drinking only kosher wine. That's why drink is up here. Keeping all the biblical festivals, the new moons, which is a biblical festival, and the Shabbat, which is a biblical festival, and people are judging them for that, then this is a words of encouragement.
Yes.
It's saying, hey, guys of Colossae, don't let people judge you because you're keeping kosher, drinking kosher wine, and celebrating on new moon and the Shabbat. Don't let people judge you for that.
The wording is important, okay? To take the statement, don't let anybody judge you in food or drink or festivals, new moons, and Shabbats, right? It doesn't make any sense to derive from that. Don't let anybody judge me for not doing that. No, what does it mean, Seamus, if you are engaging in food and drink and Shabbat and new moons and festivals?
Means I'm partaking.
Means you're doing it, right? Especially the mention of the new moons. And another thing I find funny is a lot of the same Christians who would use this as justification for getting rid of the kosher law still believe that like imbibing alcohol is a sin. But it says here not to let anybody judge you and drink. Right?
Yeah.
Like why does that argument not follow?
And there's actually a lot here. I love that there's a lot here. This is not this episode. We should definitely do this. Food, drink, festival, new moon, Shabbat. These are a shadow. The substance is Messiah. Something about kosher food is a shadow of Messiah. That's a whole other episode. I love this topic a lot. And I love this verse for it. But the last couple,
that it was going to be going away. That's the shadow.
No, that's not the shadow. So the last thing I want to hit here is the last couple of verses. If you died with Messiah to the basic principles of the world, why, as though living in the world, do you subject yourselves to their rules? And then he quotes, "Don't handle, don't taste, don't touch. These all lead to decay with use." Okay, so some people are like, okay, well, the law says don't handle, don't taste, don't touch. This is a different context. This is in asceticism. This is in like starve yourself. Don't touch anything ever. It's a completely different thing that's being talked about here.
Hedonism.
Yeah. This is not the rules of the Torah. Don't handle, don't touch. These are different things because, you could say the same thing. Don't handle, don't taste, don't touch. Oh, well, I guess sexual immorality is back on the table. No, it's not. There's a context for that. So, yeah, that's the last I want to hit there. It's an encouraging. Don't let other people judge you in these. It's a very encouraging thing.
It's fascinating actually with the comment that was just brought up, and I want to look it up.
Post it up. Isaiah 66:17.
Right, because it's another one of those that like I just wonder. For those who consecrate and purify themselves to enter groves, following after one in the midst who eats swine's flesh, vermin, and mice, will come to an end altogether. Like, how do you get around that? Like this is what
sensationalism.
This is why it's so important to certain aspects of Christian doctrine for prophecy not to be literal, right? You have to make it something other than literal because, like, I don't see how you get around that one.
You do not. Well, and there's more. Right. That's not this episode for that particular passage, but we've hit Colossians good enough. Good comment, by the way. Thank you very much. Next verse, 1 Timothy 4:4.
Yes.
Now, this one, funny enough, my father actually asked me about this one day. Because we were having a talk. Long story short, I was going through a couple of things. And he goes to an excellent church with an excellent pastor. I actually really like this church. I like this pastor a lot. I've met him. He's a very, very good guy. I want to full disclosure here too, by the way, pastors and other people ask me all the time. We've actually had pastors basically convert to Torah observance, and they ask us, hey, what do we do? Should we move our services to Saturday? Absolutely not. No. Why? What's wrong with the Sunday service? If anything, if you move service to Saturday, you're making people drive on Shabbat. So you should encourage Sabbath observance in the home, and then people can come in on Sunday. Like, there's no need to make this change. But anyway, that's me personally. People may disagree with that. But anyway, every day is a day of worship. But so my dad goes to an excellent church. This pastor's a really good pastor, and he's very knowledgeable. He knows what he's talking about. And instead of this pastor going to Mark 7 or going to Romans 14 or Acts 15 or Acts 10, he didn't go to any of those. And I feel it's because he does know better. And instead, he went to 1 Timothy 4:4, which is, I think, a better, it's still obviously not the answer, but it's one of the better ones I've actually received a rebuttal towards. So I'm going to read it. 4:4 alone by itself reads, "For everything created by God is good, and nothing is to be rejected if it's received with thanksgiving. and it's in the context of foods. So the whole thing in its context, starting in verse 1 of chapter 4, now the Ruach, the Spirit, clearly says that in later times some will fall away from the faith, following a deceitful spirit, teachings of demons, through the hypocrisy of false speakers, whose own conscience has been seared. They forbid people to marry. They command people to abstain from foods that God created for the faithful to share with thanksgiving, having come to know the truth. For everything created by God is good, and nothing is to be rejected if received with thanksgiving. For this is sanctified through the word of God and for prayer. So that's the whole thing in its context. That's the paragraph. Now, I don't know it. I'm actually curious. I don't know if I've ever heard you answer to this one, so I kind of want to hear if you've got one.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, let's do
You know, as per my usual, it's to point out the instant, immediate, obvious weak point in the argument. Okay, what's the argument being made here? Well, everything created by God is good as long as it's received with thanksgiving. So this means I can eat whatever I want, right? But okay, so let's be consistent with your words here. Heroin. As long as I receive it with thanksgiving, this is good, right? Wrong. Very, very, very wrong. And there is nobody out there who would actually agree with that statement. At least not. I would certainly hope not. So let's go ahead and like point out the weakness in that argument, because that's clearly not what Paul is talking about. Again, here we have the mention of food, not meat, food. Again, Paul being a Pharisee, we're talking about what Paul, a good Pharisee, actually considers food. And he seems to be referring to this asceticism, this these people who abstain from any and all kind of physicality of life, right, to try and achieve some greater level of holiness. It's actually like early Gnosticism, which the letters to Timothy in particular are addressing early Gnostic ideas that are creeping into the body at this point. It's one of the things that needs to be noted about the books of Timothy first and foremost. The same way the book of Hebrews is primarily about Yeshua's status as a priest. To read anything else into Hebrews is already missing the point, the main point of Hebrews, because Hebrews as a book has a main point. So same thing here. The main point of the books of Timothy are Paul addressing early Gnostic ideologies that are entering from outside of the faith.
Yeah.
And
one quick correction, though. It is meat in the Greek, by the way. It's not food. It's meat.
Oh, is it?
Yeah, it says food. And I actually like that the translation chooses food because, again, this translation is a messianic one. So it understands that when it uses the word food, it means only kosher food, only things that are actually considered food.
Right.
But in the Greek, it does say meats, which actually helps our point.
I was going to say, yeah, either be that as it may. Because it says created by God for the faithful to share with thanksgiving.
Okay. Hold on. What meat did God create for the faithful to share with thanksgiving?
Ask Noah. He brought onto the ark 7 pairs of that which was created by God for the faithful to share. And he only brought 1 pair of everything else.
That was unclean. Yeah. In fact, that's the main verse here, and that was something that I had to point out, because they forbid people to marry, which is a Torah command, and they command people to abstain from meats, which God created for the faithful to share with thanksgiving. So, and that's another thing is like, okay, well, again, if I'm a Jew, and if I like, imagine I'm a Pharisaic Jew. If I were to say that sentence, you would know that I'm obviously not talking about shrimp. I would say it would be, we're talking about food that God created for the faithful to share with thanksgiving. The reason that distinction is important is because if we go to 1 Corinthians chapter 5 real quick, actually. What is it here?
Oh, we have a good question I want to get to.
But it's I can't remember the exact verse, but in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, he says something like, hey, is this guy who's committing sexual immorality? It's like, if he's not part of the community, if he's not a believer, then he can do whatever he wants. I can't judge him. He's not part of the community. It's not my place. He's whatever. But if he's claiming to be a believer, and if he's part of the community and he's doing the wrong things, then you can judge him. And so this whole, what God has created meat, right, that he has created for the faithful to share, the only people keeping kosher laws are faithful people. No Gentile in the world is out there like, oh, better keep the kosher laws because, God said so, even though I don't believe in him. So it's very much a contextual thing. All right, go ahead and post that question.
Yep. And this is a good one. This is a rather common one, actually. Can someone explain kosher wine to me? Is it just making sure there's no insects? Wouldn't it be inherently kosher? So, and this actually applies to a number of other things, even some beers. In part of the filtration process, oftentimes among the items that are used to filter will be bits of crustacean shell, right? This renders the wine unkosher.
Yeah, and there's some nuance to this even, because
right,
you can actually use something that would otherwise be not kosher, as long as it doesn't leave a lasting and noticeable change in the taste. An example of this is if you accidentally have a drop of something that would be unkosher, like hot dog water or something, that falls into the vat. In a whole vat, it's not consequential enough. There's not enough in there. The ratio is far too large. It's infinitesimally small. So it's
the Talmudic ratio. It's like a 60th, isn't it?
As long as it's less than the size of a volume of an olive, or a 60th, less than the 60th
of the total
volume. And as long as it doesn't leave a change in the taste. And that's another important distinction, because something that could be like a drop in the bucket worth of flavor, it's an unkosher flavor, but it's so potent that you only need a drop for the entire vat, and it changes the taste of the entire vat. Well, the whole vat's unkosher because you can taste the unkosher thing. So there's actually certain nuance here when it comes to stuff like that. So kosher wine is just a little bit extra care. It's also exclusively handled by Jewish hands. Usually there's two different versions of kosher wine. There's mavushal, non-mavushal. Mavushal can be used by anybody, anywhere. Non-mavushal can't be handled by non-Jews at all. And it can be used for ceremonial services as long as it wasn't touched by a Gentile, period. There's some stuff around the kosher wine stuff. That's another episode more or less worth of information there. But yeah, there's more nuance to it than that, is basically what we're saying. So that's all the verses we wanted to hit. Now, I did want to talk about, before we go, I know we're a little over time, but please bear with us. Instead of just ending because I always feel like we're always on the defense here for some of these things, or we're sitting here and we're talking about common objections. I want to spend the last few minutes giving good reason why to keep kosher as a believer. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Instead, let's put on the offense, right? So we've said again, if anything, the New Testament seems to strengthen the kosher laws, right? Especially Acts chapter 15 seems to put more stringency than not. Now, Paul seems to take some stringency out. There are some times where he talks about if you don't know where the meat came from, you don't know if it was sacrificed to an idol or not, don't ask, don't tell, your conscience is good. Or some people might be bothered by where it came from, and Paul's like, well, I don't care, kind of thing. So Paul has a more loose interpretation. He's very Gamliel in that aspect.
Right.
Where James is very much like, no, strangled meat, it's got to be kosher slaughtered, my guy. And that's very strict. But if anything, the New Testament strengthens the kosher laws. But my favorite New Testament verse of all time is actually built into our brand name. Do you know what it is?
Me personally? I don't think I know.
You don't think I know? So my favorite verse of all time is Romans chapter 12, the first two verses, 1 and 2. And I'm going to read it. But let's see here. Our name, alternate media, as you guys know, it's spelled incorrectly, but correctly. It's correctly spelled incorrectly. Altar is spelled to say like altar of the Lord, like the altar. So Romans 12. I urge you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service. That's the first verse. Now, you know this, Brad. What are you allowed to build an altar out of?
Earth.
Earth and unhewn stone. But earth. Earth is the Hebrew word what?
Adam.
Adama. Paul didn't come up with this. This is a Pharisee teaching. That your body is an altar. You are made out of Adama. An altar is made out of Adama. So that correlation is non-consequential, is not inconsequential, rather. Your body is a holy and living altar. It is its own sacrifice. You eat what is allowed to be put on the altar at the temple because your body is the altar of the temple. Your body is the temple of the Holy Spirit. That's what this verse is saying. So alternate media, altar, net media, you are alternate. You are the alternate. You are the altar. You are altered, past tense. Whatever.
What I love about this actually is when you let that idea sink in, the implications of it begin to like spring all over the place, right? Because so again, what was done on the altar? Well, you would burn the animal, right? The animal that was sacrificed, you'd burn it on the altar, and it would send up, right, the smoke, and that would be a sweet smelling aroma to the Lord. Now, for those who are reading Tanya, you already know that the idea presented is that what you eat should be for the purpose of keeping your body functioning so that you can continue to do the mitzvahs. Ergo, the food acts as fuel for the fire, which in the case of you being the altar would be your mitzvahs, your acts of obedience, right? Mm-hmm. The food acts as the fuel that allows your acts of obedience to ascend, right? And create that sweet smelling aroma. And this is actually even also fasting gets into this. And yep, we're not quite there with Tanya just yet, so I'm not going to give anything away. But yeah, you guys are going to love that part.
Yeah. But in prayer is received to God as a sweet aroma, right? And the sacrifices are described as a sweet aroma. So your prayers and the sacrifices is a direct correlation. So that if anything, one thing I like to say all the time is, when people ask me, why do I keep kosher? Well, I like to eat what God eats. I'm trying to be as God-like as possible. Now, God only eats clean meat. God eats at the altar. So I only eat clean meat. And it kind of goes that, and that was the mindset. That's why when we talked about that over obsession with ritual purity, that's why, because they were trying to hit the highest heights of this literal interpretation of your body as a temple. And so they would, even things that were only meant for the temple, as far as the level of purity necessary, they would go to that level, even though it wasn't necessary for them.
So one of the awesome takeaways from this is the idea of your body as a temple is not a uniquely New Testament concept. It's not a uniquely Christian concept. This is one that, again, as we'll keep finding as we go through our studies, it has its origins in Judaism already.
Yeah. And so the last thing I'll leave you guys with is Leviticus 11:44, and then we'll close out. Now we've talked about a little bit before that akathartos is directly interchangeable with the Hebrew word tameh, which means unclean. So this is from Leviticus 11:44. V'tameu et nafshotechem. V'lo tameu et nafshotechem. So that first word, velo, do not, and do not. Titameu, which is, that's that word tame, it's just conjugated differently. So do not make unclean. Et, what are we not making unclean? Et points to what we're not making unclean. Naf shotechem, your souls. Do not make your souls unclean by eating these things. That's a big, it doesn't say don't become unclean. It could just not have the nafshotechem and it would still make sense. But it includes this phrase, your souls. So,
by the way, I stand as a witness to confirm you pronounced all of those correctly.
yeah, I actually screwed up, I think, the first time when I said, hold on, when I said tamau, titamau. I forgot the leading stem of the tet, but it's titameu, whatever. But yeah, I want to focus on nafshotechem, which is your souls. So,
right, comes from nefesh.
Nefesh, your souls. That's the root of the word. Now, the idea of, this is the only command that's like this, by the way. Like usually when you become unclean, your body becomes unclean and you can transfer it. You can't, if you eat something unclean, you or your soul becomes unclean and you can't transfer that. It's an unclean soul. It's a completely different uncleanliness. This reminds me specifically of the time in Mark 5. And then Mark 5, and we'll call it.
Love Mark 5.
Mark 5, I guess starting in verse 8, right? Yeshua said to him, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." Akathartos. Then Yeshua began questioning him, "What is your name?" He answered, "My name is Legion, for we are many." Right? He kept begging him. Now a large herd of pigs, which is a unkosher animal, was feeding on the hillside nearby. The unclean spirits urged him, saying, "Send us to the pigs so we may enter them." Yeshua gave them permission, and the unclean spirits came out and entered the pigs, and the herd, about 2,000 in number, rushed down a cliff and were drowned in the sea. Why pigs?
It's so it's interesting because this just stands out as one of those like, I wonder why John Mark thought it was important to specify that this unclean spirit wanted to be cast into pigs, right? Why was that a necessary detail to point out? It's almost like it's not inconsequential. And of course, one of the responses is, well, that really could have been any animal. It could have been a herd of sheep too, and that wouldn't have made a difference. Not really. It's not really how that works. But that requires you to go into a whole lot of demonology, and the whole idea of a clean animal versus an unclean animal from a spiritual perspective. Suffice it to say, that the unclean spirits cannot enter a clean animal.
And here's the thing. Again, there is a clear difference between Koinos and akathartos. When Yeshua said, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirits," akathartos. And they want to go where? To the akathartos animals, the pigs. There is a direct something about that correlation of unclean spirits and unclean animals. And that's why when God said in Leviticus 11:44, "Do not make your souls unclean," that's a warning. It's not just a commandment, it's a warning. We don't understand it. We have no idea what the purpose of kosher laws truly is, but if anything, this passage right here gives us insight. And again, the New Testament, if anything, strengthens the kosher laws with this example here as well.
Bro, you actually just gave me more evidence for my current theories on demonology. Actually,
Oh yeah.
I hadn't even considered the wording in Leviticus, but that actually, like, I was 99% sure of where I am on demonology, and now I'm 100% because, like, Leviticus literally just gave me the evidence that I needed to prove that emphatically.
I'm glad I could help.
So that's awesome.
Cool. So I think we are well over time, but we covered a lot of good information, I think. So I'm not even sorry. I got nothing else. You got anything else?
No. This has been a really fun one. I love this topic. I love Acts 15 in particular, which is why I spoke the most about that one. It's one of my favorite ones to address. But and I'm sure there's more. We'll get questions on more that we didn't mention in this episode. But these are really kind of the big ones. These are the main ones that we get thrown at us
All the time.
Nonstop.
Nonstop.
Oh yeah, the comments are great. Well, you know, when you get Bobby K in the mix, it's...
Yeah, when you get the meme lord involved.
Well, all right, everyone. We certainly hope that this helps. We hope that you're going to be able to actually, like, reference this video. You can this will be a video you can just send to others whenever this comes up in conversation. I love what you've done to this. This is my first time seeing this, and I love it. But yes, a special thanks to our top tier, not heretics, Patreon supporters. We love you all.
I do try.
We appreciate the support. We, especially now, we understand times are trying. And you know, I do want to mention this actually for everybody who is donating, because I feel like we don't mention it enough. We don't want anybody to put themselves in a situation where they're going to be in or under financial hardship, right? So, like, if at any point you have to stop donating or just decrease your donation, feel free to do so. It's not going to hurt our feelings at all. We want you to be in a good position, right? If you're hurting yourself to help us, you're not helping us the way that we want to be helped.
Yeah, we don't want any blood money.
Exactly.
And we don't do it for the money. If anything, what we try to use the money that you guys give us to help you guys out to further the mission. It's not for us. It almost never goes into our pockets. In fact, not a single dollar has gone into our pockets yet.
Right.
But yeah, no, absolutely. We love all of our Patreon supporters. We should change some of the names. We should add a heretic tier.
Dude, yes.
But seriously, we appreciate every single dollar that you guys give. We love all of you guys. You guys make this possible. And if you haven't already, hit the like button, ring the bell so that you know when we're doing shows. We do shows every Wednesday, and then hit that subscribe button, especially if you haven't already done that. Share the video, spread the word. And I think that's all I got, man.
Yeah. Other than that, definitely, recommend whiskeys, scotches, bourbons. You guys know I like bourbon. Give us recommendations that you want us to try and, like, critique. This is something else we don't talk about enough, but yeah, like, recommend stuff to us. Tell me what you want me to try next. I already have what I'm going to try next. So what we want me to try after that. But
yeah, unfortunately, and we usually open up for questions at the end of the show, but unfortunately we're over time. So we're going to jump into the after partes. If you are a Patreon supporter, you get full access to the after partes. If you're not, consider becoming one so that you get to hang out with us after the show. You can ask us questions, you can corner us, you can roast us, or you can sit in complete silence awkwardly with us. It's whatever you want to do. We're here for it. So we're going to jump into the after parties after the show. So links are down below. Jump in the Discord, support us on the Patreon and Instagram, all that other whatever. I'm not good at this exit stuff, but anyway, we love all of you sinners.
And we will see you in the after parties. L'chaim.
L'chaim.